So we're going to begin our look at the spinal cord and spinal nerves. This will be our first video lecture, and this will really take us through an overview of the spinal cord and some of the gross anatomy. So there'll be several video lectures where we'll cover this in more detail. So let's talk big picture. So the spinal cord then is basically the connection, right, between the brain and the body. So we know that the brain and the spinal cord make up our central nervous system, whereas the cranial nerves that we've already learned about, those are part of the peripheral nervous system. Those are shown in blue. And then the spinal nerves are going to be those that extend from the spinal cord that innervate, right, the rest of the body that the cranial nerves are not innervating. So our trunk and our limbs, some of our viscera, these are going to be innervated by our spinal nerves. So the spinal cord, if we think about functions, right, the spinal cord is really our connection from the brain to the body, right, and vice versa. So our motor output then that's coming from the brain through the spinal cord, through the spinal nerves to the rest of the body, but we have sensory information that we're collecting from the body that's going up through the spinal cord to the brain. Now, another important function of the spinal cord are going to be our spinal reflexes. So these happen very quickly because the integration occurs at the spinal cord. Before you're even aware consciously that it's happened, you've already carried out the reflex. So if I put my hand on a hot stove, right, if you step on something sharp, you're going to withdraw your hand or lift that foot and put the other one down very quickly because these are happening because of the integration at the spinal cord. So we'll have another video about the details of that. But these are the two main functions that we need to think about as we go through this lesson. So in the image, this is just kind of an overview. You can see the spinal nerves extending from the spinal cord. We're going to look at a few things that we can see in this image as far as gross anatomy is concerned. Now, let's start with, remember that the brain stem of the brain superiorly has the midbrain, then we have the pons, and then we have the medulla oblongata at the inferior portion. And so the spinal cord is really continuous with the medulla oblongata. Now we have regions, and we'll look at those regions of the spinal cord and look at that in comparison with our vertebral column and see that those are named the same. But I do want you to see a couple of features right now, and that is that the spinal cord is ending really right here at sort of the level of L1 or the lumbar 1 vertebrae. And notice that what it does continue on with spinal nerves through the vertebral column, right? But the actual inferior part of the spinal cord ends here, and that inferior region is called the conus medullaris. Okay, so let's label that here. That's the inferior end of the spinal cord. Now, these spinal nerves that are going to continue down through the vertebral column, those they appear something like a horse's tail. So it's named that way. So it's called the cauda equina. So equine means horse, right? So that's this area right here. Now, the other feature that we can see pretty well in this image, and we'll look at it in more detail in another image, but we can see that the spinal cord has sort of an enlarged area here in the cervical region, right? And we can see that there's another enlarged area here in the lumbosacral region. We call those, because they're bigger, the cervical enlargement, okay? So actually, let me erase it. That is the cervical region, but this particular enlargement we're going to say is the cervical enlargement, and this is the lumbosacral enlargement. And we're going to see that some of our spinal nerves are going to come together to mix, and then they will leave as a spinal nerve to innervate certain structures with multiple axons from multiple spinal nerves. When they come together and mix in this way, it's called a plexus. And you can see that where these enlargements are, we have more sort of like this thicker concentrated area. And this is forming what we call a plexus. And notice that that plexus then, those nerves are going to leave that plexus and they're going to innervate the upper limb or the arm. So this is known as the brachial plexus because it innervates. There's more nerves there because of all the need for the nerves to innervate the arm. Now, we'll have a better look at this later, but we also have an enlargement down here in the lumbosacral region, and we'll have a plexus in the lumbar area, and we'll have a plexus. So we have a lumbar plexus and a sacral plexus, and those are going to be involved in innervating our lower limb. So we'll have a closer up look at those plexuses later, but big picture, I want you to see that those enlargements are there because of the nerves that are needed for our limbs. Okay, we're going to move on and look at some other images. I think that's all I wanted to show you on this particular image. Okay, so now we're looking at a posterior view. We can see that the vertebrae, the entire vertebrae is not present, but we can see some of the vertebrae there and see how the spinal cord goes down and is protected by the vertebral column. We can see, so this is called the medullary cone. That's just another way to say the conus medullaris. We see the cauda equina that continues on after the inferior area of the spinal cord. One structure that we weren't able to see in the previous picture is this structure right here that's pointed out by the arrow that actually is continuing on from here, is the filum terminale. That forms from one of our meningeal layers. Okay, it actually forms from the pia mater meningeal layer, and that is going to basically secure the inferior spinal cord down to the coccyx. So we'll talk about those meningeal layers, but if you recall, we learned about those meningeal layers with the brain, and they're similar. So the pia mater is going to be the one that's the deepest, right? That's right on top of the spinal cord. And then we move out and we have the arachnoid mater, and then we have the dura mater. We'll talk about that a little bit later in this lecture, but I wanted you to see that that's a structure that's formed by the pia mater. So we see the lumbosacral enlargement, we see the cervical enlargement on this image. So we're going to continue looking at the posterior view, and what I want you to see here is that just like we have regions, anatomical regions of the body, we have regions of the spinal cord, and these correspond with the regions of our vertebral column. So we already know that the regional name for the neck is the cervical region, so that makes sense, right? Now we don't have to learn a new term. That makes these nerves in the neck area the cervical nerves. And notice it says 8 pair. That's because as the nerves branch off the spinal cord, right, we're going to have left and right for each of the spinal nerves. So we have 8 spinal nerves that extend from the spinal cord in the cervical region. And then if we look down, the next region is called the thoracic nerves. Now remember, we talked about this as the thoracic cage. So these are the 12 paired thoracic nerves that occur in this region. Now we talked about plexuses in a slide or two ago. I just want to point out that there are no plexuses in the thoracic region. So we have plexus in the cervical region, in the lumbar, and then the sacral, but not in the thoracic region. Those 12 nerves don't form plexuses. So then we have the lumbar, which we already know that anatomical region name. We have lumbar nerves coming out of that region. We have 5 pair of lumbar nerves. Moving down, we have sacral nerves. We have 5 pair of sacral nerves. And then we have 1 pair of coccygeal nerves. Now I want us to look at a lateral view because I want us to see how this relates a little bit different way to the vertebral column. So the vertebral column is made up of individual bones, individual vertebrae, and we number these based on the region, right? So we already talked about our cervical nerves. Well, this is showing us the number of cervical vertebrae, and there are 7 cervical vertebrae stacked on top of each other. So C1 would be the atlas that we talked about. C2 actually has a special name called the axis, and we'll look at those two in a minute. Then we have 12 thoracic vertebrae. We have 5 lumbar vertebrae. We actually have 1 fused sacral bone, but it's fused, it's 5 fused vertebrae. And then we have 1 coccyx bone that's made up of some fused vertebrae also. So I am going to point out that we talked about that there were 8 cervical nerves, but we only have 7 cervical vertebrae. And that's because we have spinal nerves that are superior to C1, and then between each of the vertebrae, right? And then one that's inferior to C7. So we have one above and one below. That makes 8 cervical nerves. Otherwise, we have the same number. So once we learn the number of spinal nerves, we learn that we can know that that corresponds to the number of vertebrae in our vertebral column. So if we compare, this cervical region is the one that we have a different number. We have only 7 vertebrae, but we have 8 spinal nerves because we have one superior to C1, right? And then in between each vertebrae, and then one inferior to C7. So that makes 8 spinal nerves. Otherwise, we have 12 thoracic vertebrae, 12 spinal nerves, 5 lumbar vertebrae, 5 spinal nerves. And then in the sacral region, we have 5 spinal nerves. The vertebrae are fused in the sacral region, so it's one bony structure from 5 fused vertebrae. And then in the coccygeal, we have 1 spinal nerve, 1 bony structure in the coccygeal area from some fused vertebrae. I do want to point out at this, from this lateral view, we can see the conus medullaris where it ends around the inferior level of L1. And that's going to be important when we talk in a little bit about where an epidural and where cerebral spinal fluid is taken when we need to do a lumbar puncture. So one of the reasons we talked about the vertebrae is because the spinal cord is protected by bony structures, right, in the vertebral column. The spinal cord has meninges just like we saw around the brain. And we have cerebral spinal fluid that's bathing the spinal cord like we saw with the brain. So we'll talk about each of these. So we're going to look at the anatomy of a single vertebra, but I want to point out that depending on where in the spinal column we find a vertebra, they're going to be a little bit different. So we're looking at general features, but the cervical region, these are not going to be responsible for as much weight. So they're going to be typically smaller. The lumbar region then is going to be responsible for more weight of our body. So those are going to be typically larger. But generally, here's what we want to look at. We have a body, okay, right here. So first of all, this is anterior, so the front, and this is posterior. Probably the most recognizable portion that you see right now is the spinous process. So I'm jumping ahead of myself, but there are 7 processes or sort of extensions off of this bony structure. The spinous process, if you run your finger down your back or down someone else's back and you feel that the bump that we call our spine, that's because of the presence of the spinous process. Now, we pointed out the body. So there's also something called the vertebral arch. So essentially the vertebral arch is actually shaped like an arch, right? It's this area right here that I'm drawing in red that's includes a couple of components. So we have a right and left side, right? Just like we do anything else when we look at the body. So if this is the front, right, the anterior view, then it's going to be, this is going to be the right, the right side, and this is going to be the left side. So we're going to have a left and right pedicle and a left and right lamina. The pedicles are these areas here, okay? And the lamina then are the areas here. I know that that's getting really crowded, so I'm going to erase that off before we keep going. But those make up together the vertebral arch. Okay, let's get some of that off of there so we can keep going. Okay, so in addition to our spinous process, we have transverse processes, okay, left and right. So there's two of those. And then we have ways that these individual vertebra are going to articulate, right, or form a joint with the other vertebra. So we have in the superior portion, we have two articular processes. And then on the inferior side, we have two articular processes. This will be a little bit easier to see on another view, but essentially we can see the superior articular processes here. The inferior then would be those that we can't see, right, because they're on the inferior side of this view. But those allow the vertebra to stack on one another, right, to form our vertebral column. Now, probably one of the most important things I want to point out to you here in this view is where the spinal cord is found. So this right here is our spinal cord, and this opening, which occurs in all of our vertebra, is called the vertebral foramen. So a foramen usually means an opening, right, in a bone or a structure. So as these are stacked on one another, this forms the vertebral canal where the spinal cord is found. So let's look at a little bit different view. We see that we have three individual vertebrae stacked on top of one another. We can see how the spinal cord, right, extends through that vertebral canal, okay? And we can also see that in between the vertebra, we have an intervertebral disc. We can see that here, and we can see the superior view here. So when we go through our chapter for our axial skeleton, we'll talk more in detail about the function of these discs. But you've probably heard of, maybe you've dealt with problems with disc, or someone has had a herniated disc, and that's when part of this disc then ruptures, and it can cause a lot of pain because it can lead to pinched nerves. So we'll talk about that a little bit later in this lesson and then as we move forward. All right, now here's our spinous process, right? This is what you feel when you run your finger along your back. You feel the projections of those processes. We see that the bodies are stacked, right, with these intervertebral discs in between the bodies. And I want to point out the articulation. So you can see here, this would be the superior, right, articular processes. And then we can see the inferior articular processes here. So the inferior articular processes, right, are going to meet from one vertebra, are going to meet with the superior articular processes of another vertebra. So let's have a look at our cervical vertebrae. So these are going to be present in our cervical region. There are 7 of them. And remember that there are 8 cervical spinal nerves, because we have one that comes out superior to C1 and one inferior to C7. So when you add all those up, that's 8. Now, a couple of things that make the cervical vertebrae recognizable. The first that you see right away is the spinous process is actually bifid. So we have it's got it's split, right, left and right. So this is unique to our cervical vertebrae. The other thing that we notice are these openings called the transverse foramen, and those are present in our cervical vertebrae because there are arteries and veins that will travel up through this opening. Now, we are going to look at the next slide specifically at how the C1 and C2 cervical vertebrae come together. But what I do want to point out to you is there's an extension coming from C2, okay? Right. So this is C2 right here. This is called the axis. It has an extension coming up called the dens. So this dens is actually coming from C2. And it's important in our ability to turn our neck, like if we shake our head no, right? That left to right motion. And notice that there is a ligament called the transverse ligament that is also important in keeping that the atlas on the axis. But you can see that here are the spinous processes, right, that continue. And the one that's at C7 is called vertebra prominens. And if you put your hand at the back of your neck, your finger, and you run down the back of your neck and you feel a very large bony structure, that is this process. That is this C7 spinous process that it's extending at that region. That's what you're feeling. Now, again, I want to point out that this opening, right, the vertebral foramen, this is where the spinal cord, right, travels. Right, I promised we would look in detail at the axis and the atlas. So remember that C1, okay, is going to be our atlas, and C2 is going to be the axis. So remember, based on Greek mythology, Atlas was holding up the world. So Atlas is our top cervical vertebrae, which is holding up our skull. So the dens, what I do want you to see is the dens, remember, this belongs to the axis. It's just showing you how it's coming up in this superior view, how it's coming up through this ligament, okay, which is important, how it extends up superiorly so that the atlas sits on that axis, okay? Again, it is this ability for you to shake your head left to right or shake your head no that occurs because of the way the atlas sits on the axis. So if we wanted to look at the anterior view of the axis, so here's our dens extension that we can see. So our thoracic vertebrae, remember that as the spinal cord travels through this region and the spinal nerves extend, they don't form plexuses as the cervical, lumbar, and sacral region do. Now again, we're just going to briefly talk about the vertebra, and when we talk about the axial skeleton, we'll get in more detail. But the biggest difference between the thoracic vertebrae and the rest of the vertebrae is that in the thoracic region, we have ribs. So these vertebrae have to have places where the ribs will actually articulate, okay, with the vertebra. So our lumbar vertebrae, so remember that in the lumbar region is where the spinal cord is actually going to, the inferior region is going to end about L1, and then that's the conus medullaris, and then we have the cauda equina, which is spinal nerves that extend on down through the vertebral canal. But these particular vertebrae, the main thing is they're responsible for holding more weight. So they're going to be thicker, larger. We have these thicker spinous processes, as we'll see later. They're important in muscle attachment. The spinal cord is also protected by meninges, just like we learned when we talked about the protection of the brain. It's the same three layers. We have the pia mater, the arachnoid mater, and the dura mater. We have one difference I want to point out. The dura mater is only going to be one layer, whereas we saw two layers were present in the brain. Now, the pia mater is attached directly to the spinal cord, just like we saw with the brain. So this layer just on the spinal cord. Now, one other thing that I want to remind you of, we talked about when we looked at the gross anatomy of the spinal cord, we talked about something called the filum terminale, okay, or terminal. And remember, that was that extension. So when you have the conus medullaris, where the spinal cord, the inferior end of the spinal cord, and then this filum terminale extended all the way down and attached the spinal cord to the coccyx. So this is composed of, or the pia mater, right, is what makes this structure the filum terminale. Now, the next layer is our arachnoid mater. Okay, so as we move external or more superficial, we have the arachnoid mater, and that's shown here. Now, notice that there is a space between the pia mater and the arachnoid mater that is filled with cerebrospinal fluid. That's called the subarachnoid space because it's deep, right, to the arachnoid mater. Now, the way I've done these bullets, I notice it looks like I'm saying that the subarachnoid space is part of the pia mater. I'm just saying between these two layers, right, is this space filled with cerebrospinal fluid. Now, the outermost layer is the dura mater. So the space between the arachnoid mater and the dura mater is called the subdural, right below the dura. Notice I've marked that it's a potential space because in a healthy living person, this space would not really exist. But after death, we do see a space present here. Now, the dura mater is shown here. Let me draw it in for us. This light blue, okay? Notice that it does extend, and it's going to essentially extend and be connected to the connective tissue as the spinal roots exit the spinal cord. There's a space that is superficial to the dura mater called the epidural space. This is filled, so it's this space here. Okay, this is filled with adipose tissue and blood vessels. Now, you've probably heard of someone getting an epidural, maybe when they're having a baby. So it's this space, right, that they're talking about targeting with anesthesia, and we'll talk about that in just a second. So two things I want us to discuss. First is a lumbar puncture. And the function of a lumbar puncture is to collect cerebrospinal fluid if there is a concern that there is an infection in the meninges, so in the cerebrospinal fluid, basically. In order to do that, you have to collect cerebrospinal fluid. And it's called a lumbar puncture because it happens in the lumbar region. And remember, if we're talking about the spinal cord, right, it ends at the level of L1, right? That's where the spinal cord is going to end. So when we're doing a lumbar puncture and we're actually, so if you think about a lumbar puncture, if you're collecting cerebrospinal fluid, right, you have to get to the level, the layer where cerebrospinal fluid exists. So you have to go through the dural layer, through the arachnoid layer, right? Because you want to get to the subarachnoid space where that cerebrospinal fluid is found. So you want to make sure your lumbar puncture is below the level of L1, right? Because we don't want to cause any damage to the spinal cord. Now, an epidural, on the other hand, we're accessing a different area, right? We're accessing the epidural space, which is external, right? Or superficial to the dural layer. Again, though, for safety, this is going to occur, right, below the level of L1, so we don't have any issue with causing any problems with the spinal cord. But the targeting is different, right? You're targeting the layer, the epidural space that's superficial to the dura, whereas in a lumbar puncture, you're having to go all the way into where the cerebrospinal fluid exists, which is the subarachnoid space.